those of you I might not know, which seems unlikely, I'm Roxanne Coady. I'm with R.J. Julia Booksellers. And I am just delighted to be here this evening with Betsy Lerner in conversation for any number of reasons. One is, in case you notice any bias, which you will, Betsy's a good friend. So that will matter. Betsy was here for an event 8 years ago for Bridge Ladies. Was anybody from here there? So if you remember, Bridge Ladies was well, it was about Bridge Ladies. But it was also a path for Betsy and her mom and her Bridge Lady friends to connect in an entirely different way. And how many of the Bridge Ladies did we have here that night? They were all here. So they were all in their 80s by then, right? And they were like the queens. It was really, really fun. So tonight we're here for Betsy's book, The Shred Sisters. And you know, it's pretty hard to find a book that is, or it's hard for me to find a book that I think is funny, but also smart and also thought-provoking. And when I had a manuscript of Shred Sisters and then the galley, and I just whipped through it because it covers because Betsy's a great writer, but it covers two topics that I think many of us deal with, and that is the sort of fraught relationship with sisters that are loving, horrible, wonderful, exhausting, annoying. There are all those things. And then it covers another topic that I think for a long time wasn't discussed in many of our families, and that was mental illness. So that used to be, you know, the good girl and the bad girl. That used to be covered under a bunch of different other euphemisms for what it was. But those are the topics that Shred Sister covers in a way that I think for book clubs, for any of us, I've had this conversation with any number of friends, and then you find out how much mental illness is all over the place. Now, this is Betsy's debut fiction book, which seems impossible when you see the quality of it. Her other books, aside from Bridge Ladies, are Forest from the Trees, which is still a Bible on writing, aspiring writers, but really any writer. And a book that Betsy wrote, that was a memoir called Food and Loathing, about a decades-long struggle that Betsy had with depression and compulsive eating. So it's a cousin to the story that we have in Shred Sisters. So before we get in conversation, because I already went too far down this path, Betsy is a Connecticut girl, and therefore I'd like you to bring your warmest, most enthusiastic welcome to Betsy for her book, debut fiction. First event is with us for Shred Sisters.
Oh.
So one of the things that, Betsy, I thought about for our conversation, you know, you've done a lot of writing, you've accomplished a lot. Annoyingly, on top of that, you're, you know, a wildly successful, highly respected literary agent. You happen to have agented and sort of edited Patti Smith's book, Just Kids, that happened to win the National Book Award. And why now did you want to add a fiction, a novel to this, was it, you do have an MFA, you did start out as a poet. Was it sort of an arc going back to that? Was it a story you had to tell? What was it?
Is this every, can you hear? I like to blame this book on the movie Inception, which we were watching during COVID. My husband, my daughter and I, and we couldn't follow the plot. And after about 20 minutes, I said, I'm out of here. And I went and I opened my laptop, just to do email. And I wrote the first few sentences of the book without any plan, without any thought that I would ever write a novel. In fact, I'm an agent and I only represent nonfiction. If that gives you a clue how I feel about it. It's not that I don't like fiction, but I don't like fiction writers all that much. So it just started to happen. And honestly, it poured out of me in about 7 months. Wow. And it did take 2 years to revise, so I did have to pay for that. But I think what was really happening is, I think a lot of you know, we had a horrible tragedy in our family, and my older sister and I were visiting my baby sister to whom it
They
happened.
might not know.
Oh, well, then I will ruin your night by telling you that my niece and nephew were killed by a drunk driver. And my sister lives in LA, and so I went to live with her for about 3 weeks, and my older sister would go for 3 weeks, and we took care of her like this. And then COVID came and we could no longer visit. So we were in our private in Connecticut, Boston, and LA. We were very worried about my sister, who was having a hard time getting up in the morning, as you would imagine. And I had this bright idea that we should work out together over FaceTime. And
There's an idea.
So we literally, and she agreed. So we did it at 8 a.m. LA time, 11 our time. And we set up our phones so we could sort of see each other. And then we each put on the same workout YouTube on a computer. And we worked out for about a half an hour every morning, and we called it shredding, which is a term used for working out. And then we
Isn't
started.
that like when you're building muscle?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's also from guitar licks, electric guitars called shredding. Shredding has a lot of meanings, but for us, it was working out. And we started calling ourselves the Shred Sisters. Are we shredding tomorrow? And Shred Sister emails and things like that. So I think that was all working through me, this experience where I really had a hard time with both of my sisters over the years. And yet, in the aftermath of this tragedy, we pulled together. And the morning shreds, the sessions were very, very meaningful. Even if we just, talk trash the whole time, it was a way of being together and pulling together. And I think that's where the book, it really came from. But I had no plan or design. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it because I was convinced every day I would just stop. I would, not know where to go with it, or it would end or anything. So I kept it a complete secret until I finished it. And then the real work of revising it began.
So Betsy, did you, as you were writing, did you begin to think about whether it ought to become nonfiction?
No, definitely not. I wrote Food and Loathing, which is a lot about mental illness, and it was all about the voice. The voice of Amy, the main character, just came to me and stayed with me. And it was always in my mind, her story. And once I realized, oh, you can make stuff up, I was starting to really have fun with that. With nonfiction, obviously, you can't make anything up, and everything is fact-based, and you can look everything up and verify all your facts. And suddenly I could really say whatever I damn wanted to.
But I always think about a line when Anna Quinlan, who many of you might remember, was a columnist in the New York Times called like Life in the 30s or something. Well, she was on the Metropolitan desk, and then she wrote these essays. And when she was leaving to write her first fiction book, I remember her saying that what she was worried about was that she was gonna have to stick to the probable. Because real life could be the improbable, the insane. So did you ever feel constrained on that side by sticking to fiction?
It's a great question. I've always felt that people read fiction and what they want when they read fiction is for it to feel real. So they're reading something they know is fake, but they want it to make them feel real. Why? I never really understood that.
Do you want to know my theory?
Yes.
Okay. So my theory on that is that if you read about something that's based on fake people, you can take on the mantle of the fake person to talk about you. That you can relate it to you without it seeming, so like I've noticed that in the early years when we had book clubs here. And I'm sorry,
We still do have book clubs.
yes, but when I went to them. We have a lot of book clubs, thank you. And I especially remember this with a book called The Map of the World by Jane Hamilton. So if you remember A Map of the World, the mom is babysitting for her kid and the 2-year-old of a friend, and the 2-year-old of the friend drowns in the pond in their backyard. And, horrible beginning, a horrible story. And very quickly, the conversation went to, well, women who work are distracted and really shouldn't be taking care of other people's kids. And I thought, okie dokie. But and then I started paying attention to that if it's fiction, you can trash the character or you can exalt the character because it doesn't feel like you're gossiping or being mean. That's my theory. How's that working for you?
It's a good theory.
That doesn't sound convincing.
It's partial,
Yeah.
I think. And I think,
You can stay there.
I think a lot of people also read fiction to escape. You
Mm-hmm.
know, the reason like maybe you go to a movie, that's
Yeah.
also very satisfying. I think a lot of people think people write fiction so that they can camouflage the truth, and everybody wants to know, is it autobiographical? So you reading it because you know it's fiction, and yet you want to believe it's autobiographical, you want to attach to it, like what's real about it? There's just this thing that I think happens. And with nonfiction, you're not really reading to get lost in the story or to escape necessarily. You're really reading because you want to learn about something.
Yeah.
And I felt when I was writing this that I was telling a lot of truths, but I was working through characters that were completely made up.
And so because we've talked about this, when you were writing the book, there's a Rose Ellen Brown in her book Before and After talks about that families are 8-legged creatures. And you can't really pull yourself out of the family unit. You're going to be impacted. So when you think about Shred Sisters, is there an anchoring quality to how you saw family working to your own experience? Was that part of it autobiographical?
Definitely. I was a bit of a nightmare as a teenager, and I went through I had a lot of problems with mental illness, and I really, really did not like my parents, and I hated the way they handled me and handled everything that happened. But when I wrote, so if I had written this book at the age of 25, when most people write their first coming of age novels, I think the portrait of the parents would have been quite negative and rather accusatory, etc. But because I wrote this in my mid-60s, I had a lot of perspective on what I put my parents through. and I also have a daughter. So I imagined, what if my daughter called me in the middle of the night, the way I would call my parents from a New York City payphone, crying and losing it, you know, what would I do with that? So I suddenly, not suddenly, but over time, had a great deal of compassion for what my parents went through raising me. And felt so blessed that my daughter, you know, wasn't doing any of those things. She wasn't running away. She wasn't even getting high. I said, "Well, aren't you gonna try it?" She's like a singer. She didn't want smoke in her throat. Kids today are so square. But so yes, I was thinking so much about my parents as I wrote it, and I tried to make the parents in this book. I mean, I hope it's a, you know, pretty compassionate portrayal of what it's like having a kid who's out of control in your family.
Well, and one of the early things I was struck by, and I've seen families fall apart with this, or I've seen it operate where in the book, so there are two sisters. Has anybody read the book? It came out on Tuesday. So, oh, okay. So for everybody else who you're gonna have to read the book, I'm just making that clear to you right now. There are two sisters, Amy, who's like the good sister, who, if you kind of knew Betsy, you would think Amy was the good sister. That was you. And Ollie is the incorrigible, mentally ill, irrepressible, impossible sister. But what you see quickly, and I'm sure we're used to this when you see it, there was the indulgent father and the bad cop mom who thought she was being undermined at every turn. So give an example, Betsy, for us about an instance in the book where Ollie runs away for the first time.
Before I answer that, an interview asked me recently, was there anything in the book that, you know, sort of surprised you? And I said, well, one is that I thought the father was really made from whole cloth, thought I completely made him up and was nothing like my father. Then my sister reads the book and says, you really nailed daddy. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, he tried to fix everything with money. And I didn't realize that the dad in my book, whenever there's a problem, he tries to fix it with money. So is the book autobiographical? I mean, it happened. It was in my subconscious. So yeah, in the book, every time, for instance, the mother says she can't have a car. You know, she's too irresponsible. A car shows up in the driveway. She's thrilled. Ollie's thrilled. She jumps in the car. The parents have an argument. Why am I always the bad? Why do I have to be the bad cop? Well, it'll be better for you, honey. She'll drive to school. She'll drive to her practices, etc. And of course, lo and behold, she has an accident within the first month, and the mother wants to take the keys away. And the dad says, oh, come on, she's a new driver. She'll get used to it. And he just keeps apologizing for her, and things just, you know, escalate from there. But that's always his position. One line that a couple of people have commented on is that at one point his new wife says, you know, you're just enabling her. And the dad says, what do you want me to do? Disable her? And that's his point of view. I mean, he agrees that she has to be outside the family when things become completely out of control, but he's always going to be giving her money sort of in a backdoor kind of way, or fishing her out of whatever horrible situation she gets in.
You know, Betsy, as you were talking about that, did you try, as you were writing this, and maybe again, it was unconscious, just like you're saying that you didn't realize you were covering your dad so perfectly, where you thought you were making things worse or better than they were to your own experience, or you were sort of resolving how you even thought about it?
Definitely heightening things, because I want it to be fun to read, even in its most harrowing moments. Sometimes heightening something means bringing it down a bit, like sometimes when music drops down, it gets more stirring. I mean, you're thinking about all of that. As I said earlier, I wanted people to feel that it's real. So yes, I was thinking about all of that, but I wasn't trying to exorcise anything in myself that I was aware of. I caught a wind with that voice and it just took me.
Yeah, so there's a couple of lines in there that I'd like you to help us understand more. One was, and I saw this in my own family, that acting crazy, you say in the book, acting crazy got Ollie a get out of jail free card. And one of the conversations that we had in our family that I've seen in other families is when you have someone that's mentally ill in your family or in your sphere, it gets confusing to know when their behavior is manipulative and when it's beyond their control because of their illness. How do you think about that based on your own experience and plus in the book?
And that goes to the heart of so much that in the book, and I think about mental illness because the person with mental illness sometimes seems very much to blame because of their behavior, and their behavior can often be extremely manipulative. And sometimes it seems quite deliberate, and always quite deliberate. And it's a big question mark that hangs over the life of anyone who's dealing with mental illness, because it's not a fixed state. It's a mixed state, and it's a moving target. So somebody who's battling mental illness can be, in very out of control and not even know it, or they can be in a sort of middle area where they know they're manipulating, or they can be completely manipulating you. You just don't really know, and it's very hard to take as a family member because you don't want to blame the person, and yet if a person has an illness like cancer or leukemia, you never would blame them, right? They've been struck with this horrible illness. But with mental illness, if you're high functioning or functioning pretty well, it seems like, well, why can't you control it? Why? Right. You can sometimes, so why can't you all the time? And it sometimes seems like somebody's sort of playing the depression card to get out of doing something they don't want to do. Sometimes I think that's true. Sometimes I think they're not in control of it.
A book that came out a couple of years ago, I think the title was The Normal One. And it was about two sisters, and one sister had all sorts of behavioral mental health issues. And so the normal one is held to an impossible standard that they can't add to the trouble. They have to make things better. So when I was thinking about Amy, and she was like a nerdy good girl doing everything the right way, to what extent do you think Amy as a character or in a real life person is like forced to be good, or that's who they are? Because it ends up shaping them.
I think that's the question about all siblings, right? I mean, to what extent are you, if your brother is the clown and you crack up, and then are you the more serious one because he's taken up all that oxygen in the room? Or how do you define yourself in your family to get love and attention? So if somebody's getting it one way, maybe you're going to get it another way. I'm the middle of three, so I consider myself a horrible triangulator who tries to get my way by destroying other people. But yeah, I mean, birth order has a lot to do with it. Gender has a lot to do with it. And I think there's no way that you're not affected by your siblings. So if the oldest is academically highly successful and you're not like that, you might want to make your mark in athletics or being the funny one or being
or the bad girl.
or the bad girl, whatever it is. Yeah, I think people are very much affected by their siblings and by what's going on. And often when somebody is very mentally ill or very out of control, the siblings will want to be very good because they don't want to upset the parents anymore. And they feel they must keep the peace and not rock any boats. Certainly Amy feels that way, though she always feels that she's being, that she's in the shadow
Yeah.
of Ollie and can never really get her parents' attention, even though she does everything quote unquote right.
And when you read the book, a lot of what you did in the book, Betsy, aside from being funny about serious things, which makes your reaction as a reader that much more impactful, that was the adhesiveness between the two sisters. And that was the part that I wonder, how often do you see that adhesiveness in real life? And how often is it just a break? That you read the story about the homeless crazy person found on the sidewalk and you find out that their brother's a doctor in, Bedford Hills and their sister is a Hollywood producer. What do you think it is that when you were writing that and it remained adhesive, or it ebbs and flows, but fundamentally was adhesive? What do you think that makes that work?
You mean the connection between the two
Yeah.
of them? It's interesting. My older sister's 2 years older than me. She's not here, right? So,
I'd like to see what they would like.
well, when we were probably maybe 22 and 24, we stopped speaking and I wouldn't go home for holidays. It was really rough. And we had a baby sister and she actually said, "You guys are tearing the family apart. You better do something." She was all 10. So my older sister and I went for therapy together. We just had one session with a fantastic social worker. And he said, write a list of all the things, the top 10 things you love about each other and the top 10 things you hate about each other. And we get there and it turns out that our lists were identical, just opposite sides of the same coin. So for instance, I always wanted her to protect me and she always wanted me to look up to her. And it was just that way all the way down the list. And we did make peace after that. And we learned to just control ourselves and get along well enough to go home together. But that session always made me realize how connected we were, even though we couldn't get along, that we still desired the same things from each other. And I think the first one, which probably is the most operative in the book, is a younger sister worships an older sister. The older sister can punch her in the face, she'll come back. The older sister can share with her and she'll feel that the light has shined, and the baby sister wants to be protected. It's just what those relationships are, and they're often really frustrated and they don't work out the way you want. That's why there's so much friction between sisters, obviously. But that was something I think I was exploring between the two girls in the book.
Yeah. Because in the book, you're both surprised and touched as you think about the relationship between the two sisters. So having written one fiction book, do you think you're going to want to write another one?
Yes.
All right, we'll talk about that after. What I'd like to do is pivot for a second, because one of the things that cracked me up is the story. So you represented Patti Smith in Just Kids, and you have an incredible relationship with her. In fact, I want to go back to a story that you told me the other day when we had breakfast, but how did you even come to represent her?
I wrote her a letter when I was an editor. I was an editor at Doubleday, and I just wrote a letter to her lawyer and said, "Do you think she might want to write a book? I'd love to discuss it with her." And It was a physical letter. This was sort of just as email was just kind of starting. It's 27 years ago. And 6 months later, the lawyer called me and said, would you like to have lunch with her? And I said, what? So that's how it started.
Share the story with everybody that when you were just in Europe with her, about her kind of resilience in the way she approaches what she was doing.
Well, she's off the record, finishing a new book. And we worked on it sort of all day long, from about 8 in the morning till 4 o'clock, when she'd have to go for sound check, and then she would do a
But
concert.
literally work straight.
Yeah,
not
we
like,
worked straight, and she's a workhorse. She only wants to work, really. And we would just work on this manuscript side by side for hours and hours, and then I would collapse and she would, at 77, do a concert. It was amazing.
but Betsy, you described something that has really stayed in my head about the detail with which she would do it and what you would witness was going on.
Roxanne, these are trade secrets.
Oh, it's about, I don't mean the literal, but the outcome.
Well, if you know her work at all, she's really a poet, and she's never really been interested in writing nonfiction. So when I approached her to do a memoir, and she admitted that Robert Mapplethorpe, her great friend, had always asked her to tell the story of their life, she decided to do it. But nonfiction was really something very new to her, so it just took a lot of shifting in her psychology to even sort of figure out how to do it. And she writes sort of ecstatically and in bursts, and then I come along and put in commas and semicolons and maybe some spelling. She didn't go to college. She's self-taught. Genius. So we worked very closely hand in hand on that. But I mean, I've had the privilege of watching her actually write right in front of my eyes. And well, I'll tell you, I shouldn't tell you this, but sometimes when she writes something that's so brilliant that I can't even bear it, I say to her, fuck you.
You can't say that to anybody.
And she's like, yeah, I know.
Well, it was that element when you were telling me the story of actually watching what genius put to paper looked like that I was struck by the way you described it.
Yeah, I mean, she writes things that sometimes are so convoluted or so compact that to make them more understandable, they need a lot of teasing out. So it's I ask a lot of questions and then sort of find out what she was really getting at with certain imagery that, poetry, you're okay not understanding certain aspects when you're reading it. You just sort of go with the fact that this is imagery and metaphor. And
I'm glad you said that.
but when you're reading nonfiction or a memoir, you don't want to be lost. You do want to know where you are, no matter how elevated the language is from time to time. So watching her unravel some of her own metaphors or some of her own imagery, watching that happen, for me, it really was like a kid looking in an aquarium for the first time and some huge fish just comes up and you're like, it's astonishing. It's astonishing.
So before we open it up for questions, you've been an editor. You can hear me, right? You've been an editor, you've been an agent, you're a writer. What do you think the state of publishing is today?
Well, everyone says doom and gloom, but they've been
saying that forever.
Since I first came into publishing. You forgot to mention that I'm a book talker.
That was my last question.
Oh.
Don't go there
I'm
yet.
sorry. Well, I have to say that because it's a book talk that's made me feel very reinvigorated about publishing. And seeing all these thousands of kids out there, young people, all ages, but sort of on the younger side, reading and recommending books and talking about books has made me, and it's impacted publishing, and books are selling. And that's excited me tremendously. As far as everything else goes, you know, it's a tough business. It's
Yeah.
hard to make it. A lot of my clients, some have done very well, others publish one book and disappear, others, their sales tracks just keep going down, down, down. It's very rough to be a writer and try to make, you know, any kind of impact or living.
I just read something the other day, or maybe it was in the New Yorker. There was an article about independent book selling by Louis Manon. And there was a data point in there that something like 70% of the books published by the top 10 publishers sell under 2,000 copies or something.
True.
I mean, that feels crazy.
Yeah. It is. The top of the list, the 1%, makes all the money and keeps the lights on and keeps everybody able to do it. But yeah, most books do not succeed. I mean, you have to define succeed, of course, but
Pay the bills.
yeah, pay the bills. But the publishers know this, and this has been their model, that no one's very
And you
few.
don't see it changing.
I mean, some presses, not really. In
Mhm.
fact, it's only gotten worse because now there's been so much conglomeratization that everybody is sort of becoming more the same and wanting the same book. And so people are
Yeah.
willing to spend millions for the same book and not spend at over 100 books. Do any of you watch that Couples Therapy TV show with
Yeah.
Lorna? Do you know what I mean? Anyway, she just sold
It's
a
on my
book.
list to watch.
And she just sold a book, and I think there were 16 publishers bidding for it, and it went for multiple millions. And, you know, I'm sure it'll be a good book, and she has a lot of exposure with a TV show, but it was just one of these things that in the publishing industry is just happening more and more. If you're famous, if you have a huge platform, you're gonna get a ton of money and everything will be invested in you and that book working.
Because you come with your own marketing machine.
Yeah.
So speaking of marketing machine, share with us how you became a TikTok star.
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far, but I really wanted to learn about it and get into it. And there's sort of two ways. You can watch everybody else's stuff, or you can engage with them and leave comments and all that, or you can create your own content. And I sort of decided I would try both, my hand at both. And I had a good friend who said if I wanted to get anywhere, I had to be on camera, which I said absolutely not. And I was making all these little artsy fartsy videos. And then they weren't performing, they weren't getting any visibility. And then she said, now do you want to maybe try? And I said, all right, maybe I'll try. And she said, you've got to do something that you can do every day. You have to post often to get anywhere on these platforms. So I went home and I realized that I had a stack of about 30 diaries from my 20s. And I thought, what if I read from my diaries and just get on camera and say a little something? Well, the first one I posted went viral. And then I was just off to the races. And I have about 21,000 followers, and they're mostly kids who write to me and say,
Me too.
I feel this way all the time. Thank you for being honest about it. So I find it very moving, and I love it. And then I've also become friends with a lot of influencers, and a lot of them are holding up my book on TikTok and saying you have
And
to
they're
reach out to
horrible
sisters.
doing it.
Yeah, it's really fun.
So Betsy, a lot of the journal entries are pretty intimate. You know, I've kept journals for years. I read some of them, even going back to my 20s or 30s, and cringe, like, what a pathetic creature. Like, you know, it's not they are philosophizing about the world. It's like petty little garbage. So How exposed were you willing, you obviously were willing to do it. What thought process did you go through to say, what the hell?
Well, don't forget, I'm keeping diaries since I'm about 8 years old.
Yeah,
I've written a bunch of books. I blogged for over a decade.
right.
I sit down with a person at lunch and I walk away knowing probably some of the most intimate details of their life. I am not interested in anything unless it's intense and personal and costly. So it's fun for me. And I mean, reading the diaries has made me very sad. There are days when I just feel like, oh, you poor kid. And you never thought you were gonna get married, have a career you loved, have family. I mean, I was so lost and lonely and so confused, but it doesn't make me cringe. I mean, I really feel a lot of, I mean, some of, I mean, obviously I'm.
My journals would make you go.
They're pretty cringeworthy, but they also are true. I mean, and, you know, getting back to the first thing we're talking about, you know, I think that these kids like hearing the truth. That you don't know how you're necessarily gonna get through anything.
Yeah,
Or that you're just so painfully lonely, or you haven't had sex in 6 months, or, you know, whatever it is. Everybody feels these things. I mean, not everybody, but my audience.
so, Betsy, do you think, I mean, because a lot of that is, I remember going to Kev's, my husband's 50th reunion from high school. And so we were at a table with a bunch of people that he was, you know, friendly with in high school. And there were a couple of women that I had known also. My husband and I started dating in high school. And it turns out at this 50th reunion, which was different than the 25th, when they were talking about they were king of the mountain, they were making millions, they were cooler than cool. Now they were talking about more intimate things. And one of the things that came up a lot was my mother was an alcoholic. That's why no one was allowed over. My father beat me. I mean, look at Ina Garten's memoir now coming out and saying that. So one of the things that you appreciate, you know, that any of us appreciate is by making these topics safe, that you would think that people would feel better about knowing that they're not alone. But in fact, what we're reading about is they're only more anxious, which feels oxymoronic to the fact that there's more intimacy going on and understanding that you're not different or alone or a terrible person.
Well, you know, anxiety is the buzzword now. I mean, every kid is taking medication and anxieties run rampant, and I don't know what that's about. Everybody's blaming it on social media and living on devices and not having human contact.
Right.
And I think that is a big part of it. But people, I mean, since the 70s, really, Oprah in a way was really the first to open all this up.
Right.
In a very, very public way. And I, for one, was very grateful for it because my family was cloaked in secrecy. And it took me a long time to finally get to the truth of matters. But I don't think that there's like a one for one of we're more open and we're more anxious. I think they're sort of different.
That they're not connected.
I don't think so. And I think I still think there's a lot of stigma around mental illness. And
Yeah.
As much as walls have come down, I think there's still, I mean, so many parents say to me, you know, my daughter's cutting herself, or this is happening, or that's happening. And they're flooded with shame and confusion and pain. And, but at least they're talking. And, you know, that's, to me, is the most important thing.
So this conversation may not have quite communicated how funny this was. I'm just gonna have to take my word for that. But we have a few minutes to take any questions. Yes.
Is Gail Amy in the book and you're Ollie?
I am Amy and I am Ollie.
We figured that
I'm
out. a
also
long
the
time ago.
mom and the dad, and the friend who betrays Amy and her
I
first
the
husband.
gift. I know what she was like. When I didn't,
Yeah.
you were young.
Oh, you're a witness. Ah,
You
okay.
know, I think that both of my sisters informed both of the characters and our relationships, for sure.
I wish your sisters would have been here. We could have asked them what they thought about.
I mean, they told me that they did not see themselves in the book.
Yeah.
They saw my parents, they saw me, but I think I pulled a fast.
Yeah. That's what I think.
Yeah.
You were talking earlier that you thought you made the father character up out of whole cloth, but then found out later that there was a lot of what your actual experiences in it. Was there anything that happened sort of the opposite way, like you thought you were talking about your life, but then as you wrote more, it was something completely different?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's where the story actually, where the plot comes in, things that I made up. I mean, there's a big betrayal in the book that completely is made up, but I'm also a person who, when I was younger, often felt very betrayed by people. So that was something, you know, like my best friend always would ditch me for a date, that kind of thing. But, is she here?
We could call her. But, you know, don't talk shows do that? They like call the person down, like, hi, this is Betsy Lerner. Yes.
I'm curious, having had this experience with your first fiction novel, do you think it will change or impact how you edit others going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. What really impacts me is that my editor was amazing. And she took me through two very serious editing for structure, for emotional
Sequence.
impact, and sequence, and I overwrite a lot, and she just kept cutting and cutting and cutting. Every character in the book had about a 7 or 8 page backstory gone. And seeing what she did, and because I'm so old and experienced, I didn't really think anyone was going to teach me any new tricks as an editor, but her editing was so exceptional that I definitely am doing, I think, giving the better edits to my clients now. That was really a great gift.
Yes.
And will this change your mind at all about representing fiction writers as a category?
I will not.
I think that's right. I think you better put a great big notice up on the website, otherwise you will fairly be inundated.
Yeah.
Fiction submissions.
No, I leave that to the other agents.
Yeah.
You have agents in your
Yeah.
office that represent fiction.
Yes.
So how many, speaking of that, how many proposals or manuscripts? What percent of the proposals or manuscripts that you see do you decide to take on?
1%.
Anybody here an aspiring to be published writer?
Not anymore.
All right, why don't we take 2 more questions? No more yes, sir.
How, just from a practical, how did you get the blurb in People magazine? How does that come about?
The publicity people send the book to everyone, and you hope. Yeah.
Did you see the piece in the New York Times about Betsy?
Yeah.
That was.
Okay.
And, oh, tell them how you picked that picture.
My author
Yeah,
photo?
your author photo.
I put 4 photos up on TikTok and I asked people to vote. And I said I was going for something between Donna Tartt and Jane Austen. And everybody voted on the picture that's in there, which was not the one that I would have
It's a
chosen.
great picture.
But I just thought, I asked and they answered, so I went with it, yeah.
That's great.
Yes,
Oh, I'm curious, did you wrap yourself, or how did you pick your editor? How did that process happen with your agent? Did you have an agent?
I have an agent who sent it to about 20 editors, and I went with the one who liked it the best.
and you loved your publisher.
Yeah, I love Grove Press. They're one of the last indie presses, and they're so old fashioned and they're so wonderful and it's like a family. I know everybody and they're very collaborative and
They're very old school.
very old school.
Yeah,
They're not even on TikTok.
yeah.
So
That's
I'm like
funny.
teaching them about it.
So how do their books get the word? I mean, your book's gotten a lot of publicity. But how are they getting the word out if they're not using social media?
Well, I think they are on Instagram.
Well, that's
But-
social media.
Yes, that is social media. No, I said they're not on TikTok.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they are really, they're very invested in indie bookstores. They
Yeah.
do a lot of hand selling to the indie bookstores. They're beloved in that community. And they have excellent publicists who have deep Rolodexes. A word I'm sure a lot of people here remember, who they can pick up the phone and call somebody at the New York Times and say, please pay attention to this author, please pay attention to this book. Whereas at a huge publishing house, they're just gonna send out 500 galleys with you know, an email blast. And there's nobody answering the phone or it's personal.
Yeah,
It's still very personal at Grove and at some smaller presses. And that, I think, for me anyway, has made a huge difference.
because one of the things that we noticed, and this was about the pandemic and working remotely, and I'm generalizing. But there are a lot of publicists calling it in now, where you feel like they're, whether it's the loss of collaboration or, the dog wants to go for a walk or whatever it is. But you do see the difference at a number of the publishers. I think you see it with Cindy Spiegel, you see it at Grove. I mean, there's a bunch, and even in the big houses, there are people doing it. Big house sounds like jail. I meant the big publishing companies. But that Rolodex reminds me when our son had his first job, he was going out to San Francisco and doing all this stuff, and Kevin said to him, that's gonna be great for your Rolodex, and Edward said, what's a Rolodex? All right, so in closing, I have an assignment for all of you. As I wrote the other day, and as I've said to anybody who doesn't push me away, I think, Shred Sisters is one of the best fiction books I've read in a long time, and I read a lot of nonfiction. Because I find a lot of the fiction books are sort of telling the same story over and over again, and I don't care. So it is not easy to get on the bestseller list, and we're starting with a small group here. But I would like to make sure that you all read the book. I'd like you to make sure you tell anybody that you know that likes to read, or people who haven't read in a while and are looking for sort of a gateway drug to read. I want you to be talking about Shred Sisters as much as I've been talking about it. So do you think you can do that? Okay, great. For those of you who read it, if you don't agree with me, don't say anything. But I'm sure you agree with me. And Betsy, Betsy and I have breakfast a lot together. I just think having, listened to how you've gone through the process, I just really want to congratulate you on the quality of the book, on the integrity of the book, the kind of energy that you're putting into it, and the, with social media or being game. I just love seeing this happening for you. It's just the greatest thing.
Oh,
So
thank you.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay.